The Clock of Saint-Germain, written and read by Chris Halton. As a writer and acknowledged antiquary on the subject of historical esoterica, I am often called privately to view rarely seen items from antiquity. I must add, from some obscurest or remotest places where these items of varied interest have slumbered quietly through the centuries. In most cases, I have bought and added these to my growing collection. Amongst these artefacts, I have housed rare books, fine art, jewellery, and even objets d'art belonging once to the great and the good, and perhaps some dubious sources. However, because of the necessity of privacy in such matters, I will leave any further discourse to myself. I live in a large, rambling 15th century timber-framed Suffolk home, which affords me considerable space to hoard my collection. I think it pertinent to mention that the house was once part of a rambling friary, which has an extensive stone-lined cellar and a hitherto previously secret tunnel which once connected to a nearby church. The friars constructed this during the era of King Henry VIII, when his plans for the dissolution of the Catholic Church became more than a rumour. Fearing attack by the state, this tunnel was an intended escape route should it become necessary. Unfortunately, the friars were caught and forcibly ejected before they could initiate such plans. In this case, their lives were spared. The chapter house was retained as a dwelling. Still, the adjacent 11th century stone-built church, refectory and dormitory buildings were sold and demolished for building materials. This otherwise expansive space was utilised in the 17th century by 2 extra timber frame wings, added by a knight of the realm who reigned as the lord of the manor. Just after the end of the Second Great War against Germany and her allies, I was approached by a returning brigadier general, of whom I will refer to here as Henry, who had acquired from the ruins of the Reich Chancellery in Berlin an artifact in the form of an antique lantern clock. He then related to me how he came by this. Shortly after, the Reich Chancellery was taken and looted by the Russians. According to this chap, a Russian lieutenant, the clock had been found in a strong room below the Chancellery bunker. Having no such use for this item, which initially appeared to be non-working, he gratefully traded a bottle of whiskey and a pack of English cigarettes in exchange for it. He also gave a vellum document dated 1785, written in German, which I translated and claimed the clock had once belonged to the Comte de Saint-Germain, who had acquired it in London. The rest of the document was badly faded with age, but satisfied with something of great curiosity, I gratefully made the exchange. He continued, "All of this understandably piqued my interest, as Saint-Germain was a noted alchemist who lived from the late 1600s until his reported death in 1784. Anyway, I took the clock home with me in late 1946. I had it examined by a local clockmaker who excitedly told me it was made by no less than the noted English clockmaker Thomas Tompion in 1680, and it works perfectly." He inhaled and said, "Anyway, I rechecked the accompanying vellum document, which read much more clearly under ultraviolet light, and revealed the following, which I have translated for your benefit." He then produced a typewritten sheet of paper, which he handed me. Placing my monocle reading glass firmly clenched in my right eye, I read, "This clock was given to me as a uniquely personal gift upon his deathbed by my friend, the Comte de Saint-Germain, for my support of his work in Eckernford. He claimed that it was fabricated from a unique brass with mercurial properties that would allow the owner to travel time, and that the brass had been created through a lost hermetic process developed by the alchemist John Dee of England when attempting to turn lead into gold." The letter continued, "I have no use for such a clock, although Saint-Germain's work fascinated me to support his work financially, and this clock is all I have saved from his estate. Signed Charles of Hesse-Kassel, 1785. I placed my monocle on a side table and asked whether he could produce this clock and his thoughts about the letter's claims. He shrugged his shoulders and replied somewhat dismissively, "I think Dee and Saint-Germain were either delusional or quite mad. It is impossible scientifically to chemically transmute lead into gold, or indeed brass, and the suggestion of time travel makes the whole proposition of this letter patently ridiculous. Charles, or Prince Charles, to be more formal, must have been a fool to believe this nonsense. But anyway, the clock itself is scarce and is a finely preserved example of Tompion's work. I do not need it as I am retiring to a smaller house. Would you be interested? If not, I'll dispose of it through a London auction house. Of course, I wanted it, and having agreed to a rather princely sum, he arranged to deliver the item to me for approval, which was pending payment the following day. The clock arrived as agreed and was delivered by Henry's gardener from the back of an Austin van and inside a wooden crate. He handed it to my butler, Jameson, who dutifully brought it to my library and placed it carefully on my instruction onto a polished wooden tiled floor. Excitedly, I opened the crate like a child on Christmas Day, and there, wrapped in sacking and buffered by cotton wool, was the Germain clock. Having carefully unpacked the clock, I was in awe at the beauty of this piece engraved on a frontispiece plate with the words Tompion, London. As expected, the overall engraving and quality were quite exceptional, and it was indeed one of his finest pieces. But I could not find any serial number except these words engraved and hidden inside the mechanism case, Sit Dominus Caveat. Now I accept I am no Latin scholar, but translated it reads something like, Let the owner beware. That day I called my contacts in the antique clock world several times. I arranged for a professional photographer to attend the library and take photographs. Should it be necessary, I could forward them by posting these images for better illustration. Having spoken to several experts on Tompion's work, none could assist or corroborate the backstory attributed to Saint-Germain, and a verbal description could have been more helpful. Within a few days, the photos taken of the clock were posted to my contacts. None were able to add anything further that I didn't know, except that the clock was strangely marked and without a serial. And yes, they agreed it was his finest work and were willing to stake their reputation on it. Even records held on Tompion's work revealed nothing on its attribution whatsoever. Having something as unique as this in my collection was a huge buzz. Indeed, I had many offers to sell it to my contacts at double the amount I paid. Still, I was having none of it, and the strange inscription faded from memory weeks after I had paid David in full for it. I felt there was nothing to fear here. Around a month later, at around 2 p.m, my butler answered the entrance door to a caller and came to me as I sat in the drawing room with a business card on a platter. Jameson had been in my employ since the early 30s. He was a tall former military officer who served with distinction in World War I, only to be badly wounded at the Somme, which left a slight limp. Even so, he kept his military bearing and demeanour and was a reliable man to have around, and a friend whom I trusted and respected. He said, "My apologies for disturbing you, sir, but there is a gentleman insistent upon seeing you over the antique clock." I wasn't in any mood to chat with strangers as my time and efforts were absorbed by that clock, and yet it was eating away at me because my research was not going anywhere. But I was equally curious to see who was calling, so I thanked Jameson and took the card. The caller was Dr. Robert Dufresne, a professor of ancient history affiliated with Cambridge University. As my inquiries were so stymied, I threw caution to the wind. I invited him into my library, where the clock stood proudly on a 17th century Italian marble fireplace. When I arrived at the library, I saw what I presumed was the professor. He was a short but sizable scruffy fellow, wearing a 3/4 long stained navy Crombie gentleman's coat. He had fat, grubby-looking hands clutching a brown fur felt trilby hat and a bulging attaché case. I also noted that he wore relatively thick-rimmed round spectacles and sported a goatee beard, which partially concealed a pair of thick, ruddy cheeks, and his striped tie was pulled loosely from his equally grubby collar. Yes, he looked every inch an academic. He also had a distinct look of urgency as he stood waiting, fumbling with the attaché case's handle and looking nervously at the clock before him. I approached him and invited him to sit with me at a mahogany reading table. Jameson instinctively pulled out a chair and beckoned him to sit. After much shuffling and placing his case on the carpet, he removed his coat and sat uncomfortably as he put his hat on the table. Jameson hung his hat and coat on a hanger in the hallway. Once settled, I asked with a smile, How can I help you, Dr. Dufresne? Briefly mumbling to himself, he looked at me rather anxiously and said, It's about that clock you have. A friend who shall remain anonymous contacted me a few days ago to ask if I knew anything about it. You see, he was someone you contacted for advice, and I felt it pertinent if I call in person to speak to... He stopped haltingly and said, Forgive me for not properly contacting you formally by letter. I replied, Please go on. I can see it perplexes you so. He quickly replied, I wouldn't say I am perplexed, but certainly it is because of some concern that I travelled here at the first instance to speak to you. He solemnly said, That clock is an embodiment of evil. You can imagine my surprise. I was taken aback by his remark and pressed him to explain himself better. Well, some 30 or so years ago I knew the owner of that clock. He was like you, a wealthy collector, and he had acquired it and a letter from the estate of Julius Mendelssohn, who had disappeared without a trace in 1914 from his home in Stockholm, Sweden. He claimed that this clock could travel time itself, and he also claimed to have travelled back to varying periods of history where he acquired great wealth and knowledge and had met Saint-Germain himself. Before he continued, I gasped with incredulous surprise at the statements made by Dr. Dufresne. Rather excited at the prospect this clock may offer me, but equally fearful that this may be a hoax, I responded, Now listen here, old chap. I have heard some amazing stories that accompany many purchases, but this is starting to sound quite absurd to say the very least. I thought you might have some real history to share, and not this unproven fantasy. Have you any proof to back this up? Dufresne looked coldly into my eyes and replied, Let me continue. After my friend disappeared after owning that clock, it somehow ended up in later years in the collection of an SS officer who gifted it to Hitler in 1945. As you know, Hitler was involved in some dubious esoteric practices and more famously owned the Spear of Destiny, which allegedly pierced the side of Jesus as he hung on the cross during his crucifixion. He believed the spear would ultimately lead Germany to victory. For reasons not disclosed to my sources, Hitler ordered the clock to be locked in a strong room after being evaluated. I presume you acquired it from there. Am I correct? Starting to take his story more seriously, I relaxed and replied, Well, more or less you are correct, except that I bought it from a third party with a letter. May I examine that clock? I want to show you something. With my permission, he carefully brought the clock to the reading table after I placed a large and heavy book beneath it to protect the table. Having carefully placed it on top, he spent a minute or so carefully checking the exterior. Presently he exclaimed in a quiet voice, Ah, this is it. He twisted the left rear corner bracket or foot 180 degrees, and hidden from behind the faceplate, another clock face slid upwards to reveal itself. I was amazed to see this aperture in such a compact clock. The face was gold with 13 runic symbols to denote each hour, and instead of 2 hands, there was one, the hour hand. Once revealed, the main face stopped and was replaced by the exact time on the other face's hand, which continued to tick. It was 3 o'clock and motioning slowly. Dufresne pointed out that the numeral 3 in the runic script was Priya, corresponding to an engraved P-like symbol. Pointing to the face, Dufresne said, The only number you have to concern yourself with is 13, or in runic, threaten. He added that this is the hour of the dead, which will activate and transport anyone to a specific era or time. It is of no coincidence the rune is shaped like one stem of a swastika, as it is to imagine, like one facet of evil. My faith in Dufresne's knowledge was absolute. Still, the fear that crept through my body like tingling streaks of electricity was a foreboding that I was stepping into some dark chasm in time and history. Before I could continue with Dufresne, Jameson entered the room with Eleanor, my housemaid. My apologies again, sir, for the intrusion, but it is time for your afternoon tea. I have added an extra cup for Dr. Dufresne, if that suits you. I replied, Oh, of course. Would you like a cup, doctor? He replied disconcertingly, That is very kind, but I neither drink tea nor coffee, but please do not stop on my account. Eleanor, an attractive woman in her late 30s with a shock of long dark hair, neatly tied in a bun, placed the tray on the table and poured a cup of tea into a Minton service teacup and saucer. As she poured, she looked at Dufresne with a knowing suspicion and, momentarily distracted by him, overfilled the cup. Realizing her clumsiness, she apologized and left the room with Jameson, who poured more tea into the other cup before leaving with the overfill in his hands. Of course, I paid no further attention to this mishap, as I wanted to press him further on this clock's alleged properties. Well, he said, an 18th century clocksmith built it on the exact instructions of Saint-Germain, using metal and gold that he provided for the hidden face. These items were originally taken from the Ark of the Covenant, which disappeared in 597 BC. The Ark had imbued in it amazing powers which he harnessed and used for time travel. I learnt of this secret from Mendelssohn, who Saint-Germain instructed. Saint-Germain claimed he had existed in many forms and was an ascended master who acquired eternal life from the Ark itself. He paused and continued. Whether this is true or not, I do not know, but I know that using the clock to travel time physically excites the user to the point that they will eventually cease to exist. It happened to my friend Mendelssohn, and I have deduced it is de facto evil. I urge you to relinquish ownership to me so it may be disposed of. I assured Dufresne that I would not attempt to use it, and thanked him for his information and concern. But I had no intention of selling or giving over this clock into his possession. In a way, this clock was unique as it is. With its solid esoteric connections, it fitted perfectly within my collection. Dufresne's face dropped into a giant frown on hearing my decision, and he stated he had to leave now. Having thanked him for imparting the information, Jameson escorted him from the house after he turned to me and said, "I warned you, the rest is up to you." The coming days and nights left a restlessness in me. The clock, you see, would never leave my thoughts. Even in my sleep, I found myself in places I had never seen nor been, and the house acquired a horror about it as the clock seemingly sat waiting on the fireplace, anticipating my next move. Perhaps Dufresne was right, but curiosity always got the better, and I knew deep down I had to find out. One morning, while Eleanor was serving breakfast in the dining room, she asked whether she could speak to me briefly about Dr. Dufresne. Recalling her last interaction with him, I put down the morning newspaper and replied reassuringly, "Please, Eleanor, I'm interested. Do you know him?" She sat beside me at my invitation and, almost sighing, said, "My home country is Romania. It is an old place full of many myths, legends and stories. My people hold many of these to be true, but I am, as you say, open-minded on such matters. But I am sure I have seen this man in Bucharest during World War II. She hesitated before continuing. He was in the German army as an attaché to the German embassy there. I believe he was an SS officer. I inquired, "How on earth do you know this? His English is impeccable." Elena looked briefly down at her hands before staring back at me to reply. "I worked in that embassy as a translator for the Germans, and I saw this man daily from 1943 to 1944, and the weirdest thing is that he looks the same age, and that was 10 years ago. Perhaps I'm wrong, or maybe he has good genes, but the Russians killed him from memory in 1944. You see, I had to flee Romania at that time because the Russians would have treated me as a collaborator. I am not a Nazi, but the Germans were the allies of the Antonescu regime, and my employment by the Germans put food on my family table." Almost tearful, I consoled her and asked, "Is that why you now live here?" She replied, "Yes, and I am afraid to return as the Russians still occupy Romania." I assured her she was safe in my employ and asked, "Can you recall his name? I mean to say, if he was an SS officer and now here in England, he must be using an alias." She then stood up and replied, "Forgive me, you are a kind and decent man, and I must return to work as your food is getting cold. I believe his name and title were Sturmbannführer von Kaisinger. He was a cultural attaché working with the Romanian government on an archaeological project. I honestly know nothing further about this man, but I felt I should warn you." I was very grateful and assured her that what she shared was in the strictest of confidence. She seemed relieved, smiled reassuringly, and left the room. After breakfast, I pondered the developments Elena had raised. I rang an old school contact in Whitehall, London, who had access to records held in the National Archives. He rang back 2 days later, having retrieved some information which he related thus. There appears to be an anomaly with this one. Records state he was killed in action during the Russian invasion of Bucharest in 1944. He was an officer commanding a detachment of SS troops from the Ukrainian Galician Division. His body, though, was never recovered. Yet another snippet of information gleaned from prisoners taken from Hitler's bunker in May 1945 states that he disappeared shortly after Hitler's suicide and had spent the last hours with him in secret. Of course, at this stage we cannot confirm that Hitler is dead, because we have no body or tangible proof, and indeed no trace of von Keysinger, except to say that he reportedly hailed from Düsseldorf in Germany. Having requested the address from that city, I thanked him for his cooperation, which created more questions than answers. Over the next few weeks, I engaged the services of a reputable London private investigator named Wilfred Jones, an ex-detective with the Metropolitan Police. All the information I had to share was a visual description of the mysterious Dr. Dufresne, plus the scant information on his business card. Jones dutifully reported a few weeks later that the address details on the card and the telephone number related to Bloomsbury in London were false, and Cambridge University had no record of him whatsoever. Also, I engaged a firm of Düsseldorf detectives in Germany to trace whatever happened to von Keysinger. However, his confirmed pre-war address in that city had long since disappeared under wartime rubble, and former neighbours who still lived there had never heard of him. They even attempted to trace a birth certificate, and again there wasn't any record of him, whether alive or dead. It was almost like von Keysinger never existed. Whoever he was, I was satisfied he wasn't born with either of the two possible names given. The clock was the only tangible item I had, and I concluded that the clock might be the only clue in solving this riddle. I mentioned earlier that the house felt uncomfortably ugly in a way that I couldn't quite put my finger on. Life went on as usual for all intents and purposes, but it felt cold and dead from the library where the clock stood, almost like a clock was a headstone on a grave, and I fearfully contemplated for whom. Over the next few weeks, nothing more was heard about Dufresne, von Keysinger, or anything relating to that clock. The library now had an incredibly depressing and colder aura to the degree that the room felt like a freezer. I spent very little time there and avoided it if I could. At night, staff complained of hearing movement inside that room, and on one occasion they were sure somebody was walking in there. But nothing, absolutely nothing, was found during the investigation. Elena, my maid, also complained about the room's atmosphere, as it was her duty to clean and dust. Therefore, I decided to make the library off-limits to everyone, as I feared what might happen next. It was like a brooding monster sitting in that room, waiting patiently to pounce. There was something evil about that clock, but its allure was slowly sucking me in. I, therefore, hatched a plan. Within my esoteric collection, I had an ancient Egyptian Middle Kingdom amulet engraved with the Eye of Horus. I figured not unreasonably that Ark of the Covenant and Horus were in period with each other, and that the symbology of the amulet's powers would protect me from any evil, whether imagined or real. Yes, I was clutching at straws. Within this plan, I engaged my faithful butler Jameson, who was prepared to help me if I should enact the 13th hour on the clock. He would hold a rope tied to me that could be utilized in such a manner to pull me from the presumed generated void that I will enter by yanking the cord hard to effect my extraction from whatever I may face. It was not perfect and rather foolhardy, but I knew from a deep gnawing sensation in my gut that this was the only way, and perhaps I subconsciously wanted to do this. I gave Eleanor and my other domestic staff the evening off the following night. At the same time, Jameson and I prepared the clock and the equipment I felt might be necessary to engage whatever lies ahead. For this, I wore the amulet of Horus on my right arm for self-protection and equipped myself with a loaded Webley revolver and a flashlight. I also carried sufficient spare rounds of ammunition and a small Bible, and as an afterthought, a small flask of holy water. All of the above was held in a canvas holdall I would carry. I didn't know what I was about to expect. Some may feel I was acting rather hasty and extreme. The clock was prepared by following Dufresne's guidance. Once the hidden face was exposed, it was placed on top of a large and relatively stable mahogany plant stand. The hour was midnight, and we had 1 hour to wait. The minutes passed with an increasing tenseness, which felt heavier for each minute the heavy hand moved slowly towards the 13th hour of the clock. I had carefully prepared for this event so momentous that I could barely contain the fear and the excitement of what may happen. Jameson, too, felt tense, but as a loyal friend and companion, he remained stoical and positive in what would be a moment of truth. In what seemed like moments, the hour very soon became upon me. Jameson carried out some last-minute tests to ensure my safety harness was tethered securely to a rope he wound around his waist, leaving some 20 feet of rope neatly lying in a coil on the floor as I moved towards the face of the clock. On my instructions, he tied an additional rope around his waist, which was firmly anchored to a wrought iron library step, in case he, too, would be pulled into what I presumed would be a void. The salient truth was, of course, we didn't know what to expect, and in all actuality I was starting to get cold feet. The moment soon arrived, and I heard a loud clanging sound from the clock, which struck what seemed to be a loud bell which... Nothing. The 13th hour had struck, and nothing happened at all. I turned to Jameson, but he was not to be seen, and the rope tied to him remained from me, slack and empty on the floor. Just as I thought it was all a hoax and that Jameson somehow decided to opt out, I heard a voice. It was that of Dufresne. I looked across the gloom of the library. I saw not Dufresne, but a man dressed replete in 18th century costume, who wore a powdered wig, a white frilled shirt, a 3/4 length yellow over-jacket with a light blue waistcoat underneath. He had matching blue breeches, light-coloured socks, and leather court shoes, the very image of a dandy. He rested with one hand on a silver-top walking cane, with his other hand outstretched to the side, and then proceeded to bow. After bowing and smiling, he erected his body and said, "Pleased to make your acquaintance again, dear sir. You are not in your library, but in a facsimile world of my creation." "And where would that be?" I retorted. "Why, sir, you are in one facet of my multiverse stretching through time and across many geographies. I exist in many periods, and as a multitude of persons, and here I am as the Comte de Saint-Germain, and it is as he that I built my device for which you are now here." "Am I dead?" I replied fearfully. He continued, "Like me, you are neither dead nor are you alive. You exist within a fold in time, and you are my guest. Your body remains frozen in time at the moment you join me. You could be here 100 years, but should you be returned, it will be nothing more than a millisecond that has passed." "So, who or what are you?" I inquired. He laughed. "Well, in your world, as in many others, I exist as a solid corporeal entity, and that is to say, being within the body of living hosts. So what are you?" "I have always existed, that I know, but should I never have another host, I will be as I am now, as a spiritual or ghostly entity who has walked in the realm of the dead. And yes, there are many here like me." "And I can presume that the body of Dufresne is that of someone you have taken?" "Why," he smiled, "of course, yes, and you volunteered to be next." I shuddered and retorted, "How did I do that?" "People that enter my world do so after being warned not to operate the 13th hour face. The clock is evil because I am the essence of that evil. But sometimes the opposite is a force for good. And you ignored my corporeal warnings, yet you came willingly into my realm. So you have surrendered yourself to me for all intent and purpose." He continued, "Hitler, for example, was a delicious evil I wanted purely as energy to recharge the clock. His body was never found, and should you have discovered the secret of the clock, you would have found no discernible mechanism. He and others have willingly donated their souls and absorbed flesh, allowing me to exist. Hitler wanted an easy escape from his bunker, and I provided the solution he readily took. Others, such as yourself, are host bodies. I will continue as you with your mind processes and history firmly intact to allow me to exist in this time until I find another host. With me, your body will never age. Dufresne, sadly, hasn't much use left for me, and I am sure you can appreciate the urgency of my situation, can't you? In return, I have a superior knowledge of history and a litany of skills and attributes that I have occasionally endowed with your kind and have gifted to others. So the exchange is sometimes beneficial. Oh, by the way, I am flattered that you wear the amulet of Horus, because I was a high priest in that cult and period. Not quite as you thought, eh? He finished matter-of-factly and said, Anyway, there is nothing you can do, and now I need to return as you. I realized the pistol would have no impact, but I guessed that despite the apparent slack rope, I was still tethered to Jameson in my own time. And so I pulled incredibly hard as he walked towards me, and I fell back over. Lying on the floor, I saw Jameson looking very concerned. You were pulling the rope, yet you were still in the room, sir. Regardless, I pulled back as instructed, and here you are. Nothing happened at all, yet you are shaking, sir. Can I get you brandy or similar? Relieved, I smiled and asked that he assist me quickly to my feet, at which point we retreated to a safe distance back from the clock, where I fired the entire chamber from my pistol into the case. As each bullet struck it, a shaft of white light beamed from the apertures, and in all 6 shafts of light appeared, each shining a multitude of ethereal human faces in white ghostly forms, which thickened into a heavy mist that took on the appearance of numerous human forms, including that of the Comte de Saint-Germain. The shrieking and the accompanying voices amplified so much that I could no longer stand the sounds. At that moment, the clock and its unearthly parade shrunk into a small white hole and disappeared for good. It was over. I remembered no more. Just after the end of the Second Great War against Germany and her allies, I was approached by a retired brigadier general, of whom I will refer to here as Henry, who had acquired from the ruins of the Reich Chancellor in Berlin an artifact in the form of a strange wooden-cased mantel clock. The end.